It's a really fascinating sociological phenomenon, I think, to look at how we, especially in the modern Western world, how we have fundamentally, culturally sanitized our image of God.
Oh, yeah, completely.
Right. Like if you walk into almost any contemporary space, or you just look at the artwork that tends to dominate religious history over the last, I don't know, few centuries,
Yeah.
you see a very specific curated portrait.
Mm-hmm.
We gravitate so instinctively toward the pastoral. We want Psalm 23.
Right, the still waters.
Exactly. The still waters, the green pastures, the gentle, quiet shepherd who carries the little lamb on his shoulders.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, it makes perfect sense why we do that.
It does. I mean, it speaks to a really deep, a very human baseline desire for safety, in a world that is just inherently chaotic.
Yeah.
We are constantly surrounded by instability, economic shifts, political unrest, personal tragedies. So our natural reflex is to seek out a divine concept that is manageable, something soothing,
Right.
something fundamentally domesticated, really. We want a deity who acts as a cosmic shock absorber.
A cosmic shock absorber, yeah. That's a great way to put it. But when you actually read the ancient texts, especially when you dig past the smoothed out English translations and really look at the raw, unfiltered Hebrew of a text like Psalm 9, that domesticated shepherd image just shatters completely.
It really does. It's gone.
The still waters evaporate, the green pastures are scorched. You turn the page, and suddenly you are no longer in a quiet meadow. You are standing in the middle of a brutal, deafening, blood-soaked divine war zone.
Yeah, and it's jarring.
It's a landscape where God is not safe.
Yeah.
And he's certainly not quiet.
No, it strips away all that pastoral comfort and just replaces it with an awe-inspiring and frankly deeply unsettling reality. I mean, this is a text that is designed to make the reader tremble. It confronts us with a sovereignty that just refuses to be tamed. It refuses to be relegated to some purely therapeutic role in our lives.
Right. Welcome to Reformed Thinking. Today, we are taking a heavily reformed perspective as we look at the foundational bedrock of divine justice and human rebellion. Our mission for this deep dive is to unpack the fascinating and really intense translation notes from the Net Bible First Edition on Psalm 9. Specifically, we're looking at verses 1 through 20.
And what this linguistic archaeology reveals, because that's really what it is, right? It's linguistic archaeology.
Yeah, exactly.
It reveals a breathtaking, really startling duality. We are presented with a God who is simultaneously a terrifying, roaring warrior, obliterating arrogant empires.
Wow.
And at the exact same time, a high, impenetrable fortress for the oppressed.
And it is a profound paradox that I think the modern mind often really struggles to hold in tension. We usually demand one or the other, right?
We want to split them up.
Exactly. We want the warrior without the mercy, which obviously leads to tyranny, or we want the refuge without the warrior, which leads to this toothless, impotent theology that can't actually do anything about real evil in the world.
Which helps no one.
Right. But Psalm 9 just violently rejects that separation. It insists that God's capacity to be a perfect refuge for the vulnerable is entirely 100% dependent on his capacity to be an unstoppable, devastating warrior against injustice.
Yes. So for you listening, if you are navigating a world that feels completely overrun by systemic corruption, where the powerful just seem to operate with absolute impunity, this text is going to completely reframe the landscape for you.
Because we are going to look at ancient Hebrew grammar that redefines how we understand power, rebellion, and ultimate accountability. The God of Psalm 9 does not negotiate with human autonomy.
No, he does not.
He doesn't sit at a bargaining table with oppressors.
Which kind of forces us to start by looking at how a human being is actually supposed to respond to a God like that.
Right.
Before the text even introduces the cosmic battlefield or the destruction of the enemy, it opens with a profoundly deliberate human reaction in verse 1.
Yeah, I was looking at the grammatical structure of this opening, and it completely subverts how we normally read it in English.
Oh, totally.
Because most of our English Bibles say something like, I will give thanks to the Lord with my whole heart. I will recount all of your wonderful deeds. And in English, that sounds like, I don't know, a lovely sentiment.
It sounds nice.
Right. It sounds like someone writing in a gratitude journal with a cup of coffee.
Right.
But the linguistic data here points to something called a cohortative form for these verbs. And the implications of a cohortative verb change the entire posture of the opening.
It really shifts it from a passive feeling to a militant commitment. Because in English, saying I will give thanks can just be a casual prediction, right?
And like, I will probably go to the grocery store.
Exactly. It's an intention, but it lacks gravity. In biblical Hebrew, the cohortative form is this intense expression of volition and resolve. The psalmist is not just feeling thankful, he is binding himself to a deliberate public vow.
Mm-hmm.
He is actively chaining his own future actions to the public declaration of God's character.
Okay, let's unpack this a bit more. Because the public nature of this is what I find so compelling. It's not a private diary entry, and it's not a silent prayer in a closet somewhere.
Yeah.
It's the difference between quietly liking a post online versus like standing on a table in a crowded room to make a loud declaration. Right?
That is a perfect analogy, because the cultural context of making a cohortative vow to recount God's deeds in ancient Israel, it meant stepping out into the communal square.
Yeah.
Possibly in the very presence of foreign emissaries or hostile neighbors, and drawing a massive, highly visible line in the sand.
Which would have been terrifying.
Oh, incredibly dangerous. Think about the geopolitical reality of the ancient Near East at that time. Israel was this tiny strip of land constantly squeezed between massive, brutal empires. You had Egypt to the south, Assyria or Babylon to the north.
Just surrounded.
Surrounded. So to stand up in a public setting and loudly declare that your God, the God of this tiny, seemingly insignificant nation, is the ultimate sovereign over all these massive, terrifying foreign powers, that requires a staggering amount of courage.
Because you were publicly aligning yourself against the dominant superpowers of your day. You're basically burning the ships of neutrality.
Exactly. You are all in.
And the specific object of this dangerous public vow is fascinating. In verse 2, the text says, "I will sing praise to your name, O Most High." When we dig into the translation history here, the concept of God's name operates as a metonymy.
Right.
So just for anyone rusty on literary devices, a metonymy is when you use something intimately associated with a concept to represent the whole thing. Like saying, the White House released a statement, instead of saying, the president and the staff released a statement.
Yeah, so praising the name has nothing to do with, like, the phonetic syllables used to identify God.
It's not a magic spell.
Right, it isn't a magical incantation. In ancient Near Eastern thought, a name encapsulated the sum total of an individual's character, their reputation, their historical track record, and their inherent nature. So to praise the name of God is to tether yourself to the entirety of his revealed attributes.
You are praising the historical reality of what he has actually done in space and time.
Exactly. And the specific title attached to that name here is central to the theology of this whole chapter, Elyon, which gets translated as Most High.
Mm-hmm.
And this isn't just a generic term of respect. When you look at how Elyon functions in the Hebrew text, it specifically pictures God not as some localized tribal deity who just looks out for one ethnic group, but as the exalted, undisputed ruler of the entire cosmos.
The ultimate authority.
The ultimate. And the translation notes point out that this role has two very specific, inseparable functions: vindicating the innocent and judging the wicked.
And you cannot divorce those two functions without destroying the concept of Elyon.
No, you really can't.
We have this modern obsession, I think, with championing the oppressed, which is good, obviously, but we get incredibly squeamish about the necessity of divine wrath.
We do. We really do.
We want a God who rescues the victim, but somehow just, I don't know, gently rehabilitates the victimizer. But the ancient Hebrew understanding of absolute sovereignty of the Most High Eri recognizes that justice in a fallen world is often a zero-sum game.
It is.
Vindicating the sheep absolutely necessitates dealing ruthlessly with the wolves. Perfect protection requires perfect judgment.
And that holy ruthlessness, that brings us to what I think is the most jarring, paradigm-shifting translation note in this first section.
Oh, verse 5.
Yes, it completely rewired my mental imagery of verse 5.
Same here. Normally, English Bibles translate verse 5 as something like, "You have rebuked the nations, you have made the wicked perish." And the linchpin word there is rebuked, which is translating the Hebrew verb gar.
Which, to be fair, is a perfectly valid translation in certain contexts.
Yeah.
There are plenty of places in the Old Testament where gar clearly means a verbal scolding. Like when Jacob scolds Joseph for his dreams of dominance in Genesis 37, the word is gar. Or when Boaz commands his workers not to reprimand Ruth while she gleans in the fields, it's gar. It implies a stern, authoritative, but relatively calm verbal correction.
But when you actually analyze the linguistic environment of Psalm 9, applying the word rebuke in this highly militaristic context totally misses the mark. It completely neuters the text.
It creates this bizarre cognitive dissonance. The evidence from the broader linguistic studies of the Old Testament demonstrates that when gar is used in the context of jinsing warfare, it ceases to be a scolding.
Yeah.
It becomes a raw, terrifying battle cry. It is a sonic manifestation of divine power designed to literally paralyze the enemy.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because the analogy that came to my mind when I was reading this research, it wasn't a school principal sternly talking to a student. That's what rebuke sounds like to us, right?
Right, getting called into the principal's office.
Yeah. Instead, I thought about the acoustic warfare used by ancient cultures. Take the Aztec death whistles, for example.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
You ever heard one of those?
I have. They are terrifying.
They are. The Aztecs created these specialized ceramic whistles that, when they were blown in unison by hundreds of warriors, produced a sound that mimicked, like, human screams and howling winds.
Oh.
And it was designed to trigger an involuntary physiological terror response in the invading army. It literally froze the nervous system. The sound itself was a weapon. And that is what this text is describing.
Yeah.
God isn't pulling the arrogant nations into a divine principal's office for a little chat.
No.
He is unleashing a psychological and physical sonic boom that drops an entire empire to its knees in absolute paralyzing terror.
That is the exact visceral reality the text demands. Look at the cosmic scale of this word elsewhere. In Psalm 104, it says, "The chaotic waters of the flood flee at the gar of God, at the thunder of his voice."
Wow.
Job 26 describes the very pillars of heaven trembling at his battle cry. This is the creator of the universe vocalizing his sovereign opposition to human rebellion. The sound waves of his voice are literal weapons of mass destruction against systemic injustice.
It fundamentally changes why the psalmist is standing in the public square making his cohortative vow, doesn't it?
Yeah.
He is praising God because the Most High didn't just send a strongly worded diplomatic letter to the oppressors. He stepped onto the geopolitical battlefield and let out a roar that shattered their psychological defenses.
Which naturally pivots the text to the identity of these enemies. I mean, who is arrogant enough or foolish enough to position themselves on the receiving end of a divine battle cry?
Right.
The text identifies them broadly as the nations, but it zeroes in on a specific psychological and spiritual profile by calling them the wicked. The Hebrew word is reshamim.
This is where the ancient context acts as a mirror to our modern world. Because when we use the word wicked today, we tend to reserve it for, like, cartoonish villains or extreme sociopaths, right?
Yeah, serial killers, genocidal dictators.
Exactly. But the linguistic profile of the Reshim in the Psalms is much more insidious. The notes define them as proud, practical atheists.
And the distinction between a theoretical atheist and a practical atheist. That is the key to understanding the entirety of human rebellion in the biblical worldview.
Okay, break that down for us.
So a theoretical or philosophical atheist is someone who, writes a dense academic book arguing that the concept of a deity is logically incoherent.
Right.
But that is actually a relatively modern luxury. In the ancient world, almost no one was a philosophical atheist. Everyone believed the spiritual realm was crowded with gods.
Right. The ancient Israelites were surrounded by people who believed in Baal, Asherah, Shamash. So what makes someone a practical atheist in that environment?
Well, a practical atheist might participate in the religious festivals. They might offer sacrifices. They might even intellectually acknowledge that a creator exists somewhere out there in the ether. But functionally, in the gritty reality of their day-to-day decisions, they live as if God is entirely impotent, blind, or indifferent. They operate under the assumption that the throne of the universe is currently unoccupied, and therefore they are the highest authority in their own lives.
They live as if their actions have no ultimate cosmic audit.
Yes. Exactly.
And the theological implications of this are devastating because it connects our vertical relationship with God directly to our horizontal treatment of other human beings. The text details the symptoms of this practical atheism, and it's stuff like lying, slandering, cheating, and ultimately violence.
It perfectly illustrates the Reformed doctrine of human depravity. When humanity forcefully severs its accountability to a sovereign God, when we decide to be autonomous practical atheists, it never results in a neutral secular utopia.
Never.
It invariably curves inward into exploitation and cruelty. The hostile empires threatening Israel weren't just engaging in generic border disputes. Their political and military aggression was the direct, inevitable manifestation of their spiritual rebellion against the Most High.
Because if there is no divine judge to hold me accountable, then other human beings simply become resources for me to consume or obstacles for me to destroy.
Precisely. And that leads to the ultimate confrontation. When these practical atheists, who think they are the apex predators in the world, run headlong into the Most High, the result is total erasure.
Yeah.
But before we get to the destruction itself in verses 3 through 6, there is a fascinating, highly technical tension in the Hebrew verbs regarding when this judgment actually takes place.
It's a brilliant feature of Hebrew poetry.
Yeah.
Because in English, our verbs are heavily constrained by time, past, present, or future.
Yeah.
But ancient Hebrew verbs are deeply concerned with aspect.
Right, the nature of the action itself.
Exactly. Is it a completed, definitive action? Or is it an ongoing, characteristic state of being?
Yeah.
And in these verses, the psalmist rapidly oscillates between perfect verb forms, which usually denote a completed past event, and imperfect verb forms, which suggest ongoing or typical behavior.
And it creates this dynamic, almost stereoscopic view of God's justice. The text is describing the vivid, bloody aftermath of a very specific historical battle where God recently crushed these arrogant nations. That's the perfect tense. It happened. It's done. But by weaving in the imperfect tense, the text is declaring that this isn't just a one-off historical anomaly. It is the characteristic eternal nature of who God is.
The historical, localized victory basically serves as the ironclad, empirical proof of his eternal character. God doesn't just act justly, he is justice.
Yes.
Because he destroyed the oppressor yesterday, we have the theological guarantee that this is his characteristic posture toward all oppressors forever. His past track record underwrites the entire future of the cosmos.
And that guarantee is what makes the visceral imagery of destruction in verse 6 hit incredibly hard. I want to look closely at the literal translation of the syntax here, because the grammar itself paints a picture of ultimate human futility.
Yeah, let's look at it.
The text talks about uprooted cities and wiped out names. It says, the enemy, they have come to an end in ruins permanently, and then you uprooted cities, it has perished, their remembrance, they.
Is the imagery of total, uncompromising annihilation. And the Hebrew word order here is incredibly deliberate and highly unusual, isn't it?
It is. In standard Hebrew syntax, the verb usually comes first. But in verse 6, the text takes the singular collective noun for the enemy and shoves it to the absolute front of the sentence. It fronts the word, leaving it isolated and exposed at the beginning of the line.
It's like a linguistic spotlight. Why break the grammatical rules to front the enemy like that?
To set up a devastating juxtaposition with the beginning of verse 7, verse 6 begins with the enemy, sitting in permanent, forgotten ruins, their very name erased from history. Then verse 7 begins with the Lord, sitting eternally enthroned, establishing his throne for perfect justice. The contrast is absolute. The enemy is a temporary vapor. The Lord is the eternal reality.
It reminds me of Percy Bysshe Shelley's poem, Ozymandias.
Oh, that's a great connection.
You know the one. The traveler finds this shattered, colossal statue in the middle of an empty desert, and the pedestal says, "My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, you mighty, and despair."
But there's nothing left but sand.
Sand. The arrogant nations in Psalm 9 think they are the main characters of reality. They think their empires, Assyria, Babylon, Rome, are permanent fixtures on the world stage. But God simply speaks a battle cry, and they are uprooted. They become dust in a museum. Their very memory perishes. Yet the Lord remains on the throne.
It is the ultimate humiliation of human hubris. The practical atheist expends all their energy building a city and making a name for themselves, which mirrors the exact rebellion of the Tower of Babel, by the way.
Oh, totally.
And God, with a single breath, uproots the foundations and erases the name so thoroughly that history forgets they ever existed.
But this terrifying display of absolute power creates a massive philosophical and practical problem for the listener, doesn't it?
It does.
If God is unleashing this sonic boom of a battle cry, if he is uprooting entire cities and leveling empires, what happens to the innocent people standing in the blast radius? Because when massive geopolitical judgments happen, the vulnerable are usually the first ones crushed.
And that is the exact tension the psalm anticipates, and then resolves in the very next breath. It pivots flawlessly from the terrifying, earth-shattering wrath of the warrior to the intimate, impenetrable protection of the refuge. We move from the rubble of the uprooted cities in verse 6 to the unshakable foundation of the divine stronghold in verses 9 through 12.
Yeah, verse 9 says, "The Lord is a stronghold for the oppressed." But the linguistic nuance of the Hebrew word used here is so much richer than just a generic stronghold. right? The literal translation points to God being an elevated place for the oppressed.
Right. And we have to strip away our modern, spiritualized, cozy interpretations of this. This isn't a warm blanket or a quiet room. It is a strictly tactical military term. If you look at the topography of ancient Israel, the high ground meant the difference between life and death. If an invading army with chariots swept through the valleys, the only way a vulnerable population could survive was to retreat up the sheer rocky cliffs to an elevated fortification, a place like Masada or Ein Gedi. It represents a defensible, secure, mathematically unassailable position.
So when the battle cry sounds, and the practical atheists are being violently uprooted in the valley below, God doesn't just put a shield over his people. He fundamentally alters their elevation. He lifts them out of the fray entirely.
Yes.
He places them in a position where the enemy's weapons literally cannot reach them due to the sheer altitude of his sovereignty.
The practical atheists rely on their own military might and their own fortified cities, which are built on the dirt and easily uprooted by the Most High. But the oppressed rely on the Most High himself as their geographic and spiritual elevation. You cannot besiege God.
But the text is very specific about who gets access to this elevated place. It isn't universal.
No, it's not.
Verse 10 lays down the condition. And the ones who know your name trust in you. And I have to pause here because the English word know is dangerously thin.
It really is.
So what does this all mean? I know the names of a lot of politicians or celebrities, but I certainly don't trust them. I wouldn't seek refuge in them. Why does knowing God's name automatically equal trust here?
Because in the Hebrew idiom, knowing the name has absolutely nothing to do with data acquisition or trivia.
Okay.
It is deeply covenantal, relational language. In ancient Near Eastern treaties, to know the suzerain king meant to legally and relationally recognize his supreme authority, to pledge absolute loyalty to him, and to experience his protection in return.
So it's the difference between knowing about someone and being in a binding marriage covenant with them.
Precisely. To know his name is to have intimately experienced his character. It is to know firsthand that he is Elyon, the righteous judge who vindicates the innocent.
Yeah.
When you possess that kind of covenantal knowledge, trust is not a leap in the dark. It is the only rational byproduct. You trust him implicitly because you know his historical track record. He possesses both the infinite power to destroy the wicked and the infinite desire to protect the vulnerable.
Which brings us to verse 12. And this introduces a phrase that I think is one of the most sobering, chilling, and yet profoundly comforting descriptions of God in the entire Old Testament. It says that God is the one who seeks shed blood.
The Hebrew verb is darash, to seek, to require, or to demand an accounting. It presents God not merely as a distant observer of human suffering, but as the great, infallible, cosmic auditor of human violence.
And just think about the history of human atrocities. Think about the mass graves, the genocides, the systemic oppression that has characterized human history. The terrifying reality of our world is that human justice fails constantly, doesn't it?
All the time.
Dictators write laws to exonerate themselves, evidence is destroyed, the powerful die peacefully in their beds without ever facing a tribunal. And if this world is all there is, then rivers of blood have been shed with zero consequence.
And that is a psychological burden that the human soul cannot bear. We have an innate screaming demand for ultimate justice, and the Hebrew grammar here validates that demand because the word for shed blood is damim. It's plural. It literally translates to bloods. This plural usage is rare when it's the direct object of the verb darash. It emphasizes not just an isolated murder, but the sheer, overwhelming scale and volume of systemic violence committed by the arrogant nations.
It is the blood of generations crying out from the ground, just like Abel's blood in Genesis. And the text declares that the divine auditor is meticulously going through the ledgers of human history.
He is examining every single discrepancy, every missing life.
Yes, he is demanding payment and restitution for the plural bloods spilled by the practical atheists who convinced themselves that no one was watching. He does not forget a single drop, and he remembers the exact, specific cry of the afflicted.
If you are the oppressor, if you are the one who has leveraged your power to crush others, this is the most terrifying verse in the Bible. The books are not closed. But if you are the victim, if you have been marginalized, abused, or crushed by a system that refuses to hear you, this is the ultimate anchor for your sanity. The Most High is actively seeking restitution for your pain. Your suffering is documented in the divine ledger.
That theological reality transitions us right into the gritty, lived experience of the psalmist in verses 19 through 16.
Hmm.
We move from the cosmic courtroom of the auditor to the desperate, agonizing cry of a human being caught in the crosshairs of evil. Verse 13 opens with a visceral plea. Have mercy on me, O Lord. See my misery from the ones who hate me.
And it is vital to understand the timeline here, because the psalm as a whole is a post-battle song of thanksgiving. The victory has already been secured.
Right.
But these verses function as a literary flashback. The psalmist is quoting the exact desperate petition he prayed before the deliverance arrived, back when he was surrounded by enemies and staring death in the face.
And he specifically contrasts two different gates. He says, you who lift me up from the gates of death, so that I might declare all your praise in the gates of daughter Zion. The gates of death represent the ultimate, inescapable trap of the enemy, but he wants to be rescued so he can stand in the gates of daughter Zion.
And here is an interesting trivia fact from the notes. The phrase daughter Zion is a fascinating sociological and theological marker. If you read the prophetic books, like Isaiah or Jeremiah, you encounter daughter Zion constantly.
Right.
But this is the only time the phrase appears in the entire Psalter.
Wait, really?
Yeah, the only time. It is a highly emotive, idiomatic title for the city of Jerusalem, personifying the city as a vulnerable but deeply beloved daughter of God.
Why drop that specific, unique idiom right here in the middle of a war psalm?
Because it sharply contrasts the covenant community with the uprooted, ruined cities of the arrogant nations we saw back in verse 6.
Oh, yeah.
Right. The nations build cities of pride, and they are turned to dust. God builds daughter Zion as a community of grace where his presence dwells. The psalmist is pleading for rescue not just for his own personal comfort, but so that he can return to the heart of this covenant community and fulfill that cohortative vow we talked about in verse 1 to publicly declare the justice of God among God's people.
And the specific mechanism of that justice, how God actually deals with the wicked, is detailed in verses 15 and 16. Because the text says, the nations have sunk down in the pit that they made, in the net that they hid, their own foot has been caught.
This is the pinnacle of divine poetic justice. The hostility of the nations is the exact instrument of their own destruction.
I was trying to find a conceptual model for how this works, and honestly, the best analogy is martial arts, specifically something like Aikido.
Okay, I like this.
In Aikido, you don't necessarily strike your opponent with your own brute force. Instead, you use the opponent's own massive aggressive momentum against them. You step out of the way, redirect their violent energy, and allow their own weight and speed to throw them off balance and drive them into the ground. That is exactly what the Hebrew grammar is describing here. Or, it's like Wee Coyote spending all this time building an elaborate trap for the roadrunner, only to have the anvil drop on his own head. The wickedness is inherently self-destructive.
That is a brilliant way to understand the Nephal stem used in verse 16. The text says, by the work of his hands the wicked one was ensnared. The verb ensnared is no klosh, and in the Nephal stem, it carries a reflexive or passive nuance. God isn't necessarily reaching down from heaven and actively tying a rope around the oppressor's ankles. The oppressor is ensnaring himself. The trap they aggressively set for the righteous springs back on them.
I do struggle with this sometimes, though, because while this Aikido-style justice is incredibly satisfying poetically, I look at the real world, and it doesn't always seem to happen this way.
Right, the reality check.
Yeah. We see corrupt politicians amass fortunes and retire on yachts. We see ruthless dictators like Joseph Stalin die peacefully in their beds of old age, having murdered millions without ever falling into a literal pit. How does this text reconcile with the brutal reality that the wicked often seem to just get away with it?
Well, that is the ultimate tension of living in a fallen world, and it requires a robust eschatological perspective. What Psalm 9 is doing is establishing the absolute, unbreakable rule of God's sovereign universe. Evil is inherently self-destructive, and justice will ultimately prevail.
Sure.
But it does not promise that the timeline of that justice will always align with our limited human lifespan. Sometimes we see the trap spring in real-time history. A corrupt empire collapses under the weight of its own greed. But other times, the final springing of the trap is reserved for the ultimate judgment, when the divine auditor opens the books.
The books are coming.
Exactly. The wicked may avoid the pit in this life, but they are plummeting toward the eternal pit of Sheol.
And the weight of that reality, that God's justice is flawless, whether immediate or eschatological, it demands a response. And we see that because the end of verse 16 features a highly unusual phrase, Higayon Selah.
It is a technical musical notation. Higayon denotes a murmuring sound or a deep meditation, and Selah indicates a pause or an interlude.
So if you were in the ancient temple listening to this being performed, the choir would suddenly stop singing. The stringed instruments might hold a low, resonant chord, but the lyrics would cease. You are forced to sit in the silence and let the sheer, terrifying weight of that poetic justice sink into your bones. The anvil has dropped, the trap is sprung, the oppressor has consumed himself.
It is a moment of profound theological reflection before the psalm moves into its final climactic movement in verses 17 through 20. The silence breaks, and we are shown the ultimate eternal destination of the practical atheists, which brings us face to face with the reality of human limits.
Verse 17 is uncompromising. The wicked turn back to Sheol, all the nations that forget God. Sheol is the realm of the dead, the grave. But I want to zero in on that phrase, the nations that forget God.
Yeah, that's a big one.
Because in modern English, forgetting implies absent-mindedness. It implies a lack of cognitive retention. I forgot where I put my keys.
Yeah.
Is this just absent-mindedness? Like, oops, I got busy and forgot to pray today.
Absolutely not, no. In the biblical lexicon, forgetting God is never an accident of the mind. It is an act of the will. It is active, deliberate rebellion.
Okay.
If you trace the concept of forgetting through Deuteronomy, Judges, and Jeremiah, it is consistently equated with idolatry. It means actively discarding the covenant, refusing to recognize God's absolute sovereignty, and replacing him with false gods or with human autonomy.
It is the intentional erasure of the auditor from their worldview. And the text draws a straight line of causality here. This active refusal to acknowledge the Most High is the root cause of their violence. Because they have forgotten the ultimate judge, they feel entirely justified in exploiting the vulnerable.
But verse 18 provides the beautiful, necessary counterbalance to this dark reality. For the needy shall not always be forgotten, and the hope of the afflicted shall not perish forever.
There's a really interesting linguistic feature here called an ellipsis. The Hebrew text literally reads, "The hope of the afflicted does perish forever." But the negative particle not from the first half of the verse carries over implicitly.
Right. The wicked actively forget God, so their ultimate destiny is to be forgotten in the darkness of Sheol. But God never, ever forgets the afflicted. Because he is the Most High, the hope of the oppressed is anchored in eternity. It is an ironclad rule of the cosmos.
Which leads to the final desperate petition of the psalm. The psalmist cries out in verses 19 and 20, "Rise up, O Lord, let not man prevail, let the nations be judged in your presence." And then he asks for something incredibly specific. "Place, O Lord, terror in them." And the word for terror is mora.
And mora isn't just a sudden fright. It is a deep, existential dread. It is the overwhelming, paralyzing awe that shatters human pride. The psalmist is asking God to pull back the curtain just an inch, to reveal a fraction of his infinite majesty so that the psychological delusion of the practical atheist is instantly obliterated.
And the purpose of this terror is explicitly stated at the very end of the song. Let the nations know they are mankind.
That is the theological thesis statement of the entire deep dive. The Hebrew word for mankind here emphasizes human frailty, mortality, and our origin from the dust. Let them know they are mankind is a prayer for ultimate humility. It means make them realize they are finite, bleeding, mortal creatures and not the sovereign architects of the universe.
And this cuts right to the heart of our modern condition, doesn't it?
Oh, completely.
We are living in an era defined by a technological and cultural Tower of Babel. Through massive accumulations of wealth, through geopolitical maneuvering, and increasingly through technology, about transhumanism, the drive to cure death, the attempt to build artificial superintelligences, humanity is constantly trying to play God. We are desperately trying to build these impenetrable fortresses so we can live as if we are not subject to disease, to time, or to divine accountability. We want the title of Ilion.
It is the exact echo of the Garden of Eden, the desire to be like God, defining good and evil on our own terms. The arrogance of the ancient nations in Psalm 9 is the exact same arrogance driving the modern secular project. And in a strange, paradoxical way, the psalmist's prayer for terror is actually a prayer of profound mercy.
How so?
He's saying, Lord, terrify them with your reality before they destroy themselves. Break their pride until they remember they are just breathing dust. Because recognizing our own absolute finitude and dependence on God is the only known cure for practical atheism.
If you do not recognize that you are merely a human under the authority of a sovereign God, you will eventually begin treating other humans as raw material for your own ambitions.
Exactly. And before we wrap up, there is one final piece of historical context that ties this all together beautifully. When you look at ancient manuscript traditions, including the Greek Septuagint and several older Hebrew texts, Psalm 9 and Psalm 10 are actually not separated. Yeah, they are presented as one single, massive, continuous composition.
So ancient readers wouldn't have seen a chapter break here. They would have just kept reading right into Psalm 10.
Exactly. And Psalm 10 picks up the exact same themes, the arrogance of the wicked, the suffering of the oppressed, and the hiddenness of God, but it wrestles with the delay of justice. Psalm 9 establishes the theological bedrock that God is the absolute sovereign who crushes the wicked. Psalm 10 applies that bedrock to the agonizing weight when the wicked are currently prospering.
Wow.
They are two halves of the same Reformed theology, trusting in the absolute sovereignty of the Most High, even when the world is burning.
What an incredible journey through the text today. We started with the psalmist making a dangerous, public, cohortative vow to praise the Most High. We saw God not as a quiet shepherd, but as a roaring warrior unleashing a gar, a paralyzing battle cry against arrogant empires.
We unpack the insidious nature of the practical atheist, the one who functionally erases God from their worldview, inevitably leading to the shedding of innocent blood. And we saw the martial arts mechanism of divine justice, where the oppressor's own violence becomes the very net that ensnares them.
But most importantly, we saw that in the midst of this cosmic warfare, God provides an elevated stronghold, a geographically and spiritually unassailable fortress for those who intimately know and trust His name in covenant loyalty. He is the great auditor who meticulously tracks every single drop of shed blood, and who will ultimately force the proud to realize they are nothing more than mortal dust. If you are listening to this right now, navigating a world that often feels entirely overrun by untouchable corrupt powers, hear the weight of this ancient text. You are known by a sovereign God who does not lose the ledgers. He has not forgotten a single tear, and He will demand an accounting for every injustice. The battle cry has already been sounded, and the final victory is absolutely assured.
As we close, I want to leave you with a final thought to chew on. We've established that forgetting God is never an accident. It is an active lifestyle rejection of His authority that always results in exploiting others. So ask yourself, in what subtle, culturally acceptable ways might our modern society, or even you yourself, be actively forgetting God right now? And how does embracing the terror of our own limits, how does deeply, truly recognizing our status as mere mankind actually become the very mechanism that saves us from becoming the oppressors we despise?
That is the exact tension we need to live in. Thank you for joining us for this extensive deep dive. We hope this exploration of Psalm 9 has challenged your assumptions and given you a much fiercer, richer view of the Most High. Keep reading, keep asking the difficult questions, and we will see you next time on Reformed Thinking.